This over here is the Asus Zenbook Pro Duo 14 OLED laptop, and this is the 2022 version. And in this video, we're going to talk about the benchmarks for creators, as well as giving you the crucial tips when buying this laptop. Because this laptop is not user upgradable, you need to configure it beforehand, and you need to know what your creative workflow is like to configure this laptop. Because what you don't want to do is pay for some specs that are absolutely going to bottleneck the performance of this, or overspend something on this that actually aren't going to give you any performance in return. So let's talk.
This video is sponsored by Artlist, which is also my go-to music and sound effects licensing site. Music license from Artlist is covered by a worldwide royalty-free license, which includes all projects from personal YouTube videos to high-end TV commercials. Once you've downloaded a song with active subscription, it's yours to keep forever. New music and sound effects are added to the site daily, so you'll never run out of choice. Now also featuring Artlist Personal Plan that covers all your social channels. Pay monthly or save even more when paid annually. Your license lasts forever for all published projects during the subscription period. And the best part is, if you sign up through the links in the description below, you'll get 2 months for free. So check out Artlist in the video description below.
Not to make one long video about this laptop, I've slotted this laptop review into 3 separate parts. This is part number 2, where we're going to talk about the performance and configuring the laptop. Part number 1 was overview, unboxing, and what this laptop is like and some of the specs and so on. It's very important for you to know, like if you want to know what's inside the laptop and what it comes with, because it comes with some very interesting things. And then part 3, we're going to do a long-term review, because my current laptop has actually broken, so I'm going to adapt this one to my workflow, just try to use it in long term. So if you want to know what the long-term user experience has been like, then stick around for that one. Because what I'm curious about is this dual screen laptop actually helpful for my creative workflow, or is it just a gimmick? I'll leave the 3 parts in the description below, so you can just easily find them in there, as well as the links for this laptop if you're interested in purchasing this. So before we're talking about performance, we need to talk about the specs for this laptop. I have the i7-12700H model with the XE graphics with 96 EUs, which basically is just a souped up version of the USD 770 on the desktop side. Like the Intel 12th gen desktop chips have iGPU inside there that actually has a 32 execution units. So this one has a little bit more graphics power, but a lot of the other parts of the graphics are the same. In terms of RAM, this model has 16 gigabytes of DDR5 4800 megahertz CL52, and it's quad channel. So it's interesting because this has been actually soldered to the motherboard, and it comes across as actually quad channel on the specs, so probably like 4 gigabyte sticks, something like that. But then interestingly, on Task Manager it says that 8 DIMM slots have been populated, so very interesting kind of spec in there. And then the SSD is a 500 gigabyte NVMe Gen 4 SSD. So then some of the benchmarks. First of all, Cinebench R23, and this is going to be very, very interesting and very impressive. Now listen to this benchmark. So basically the single core performance is 1,803 points, whereas the multi-core performance is 15,276. And you might be looking at these benchmarks and thinking, well, you know, I don't know, how good is it? Is it any good? So it's just a few comparisons. If we look at the 11900K desktop chip that pulls up to 290 watts from the socket, absolutely ridiculous, right? Just from last generation, the i9 from last generation desktop size, without any thermal limitations, without any performance limitations, just let it run stock as fast as you can, then it is literally within 1% of the multi-core performance scores. Sometimes the 11900K gets actually lower scores than this laptop. In terms of the single core performance, is 200 points faster, which is quite a bit, and this laptop feels very, very snappy. If we are looking at the M1 Max from Apple, for example, then the multi-core score is 12,380 and single core score 1,521. So CPU performance in this small form factor is absolutely amazing. It's absolutely ridiculous how fast this is. Moving on to Geekbench 5, the M1 Max here now interestingly gets slightly faster scores than this one over here, but still we're beating out the 10900K, for example, from the generation before, which is a desktop chip and gets 11,201 points. In fact, the 11900K is even further back at 10,855. So this is absolutely amazing performance in a laptop form factor. In fact, we'll really be performing about the same as the desktop 12600K chip, which single core performance is about the same, but the multi-core performance is literally the same between this and the desktop 12600K. Now, interestingly, looking at the Geekbench 5 GPU performance to really just see where does it slot in, we can see that the OpenCL score for this Xe graphics is 20,191, which is actually a little bit faster than the Apple M1 8-core GPU that you can find like in your M1, chips, which is actually not that impressive. As you can see, we would expect it to be much faster in this one here, but obviously the 8-core and 96 execution units is actually not the same spec, but just interestingly, that's where it slots in there. In terms of the iGPU from the desktop side, like the UHD 770, this chip is about 2.2% better than that one, where we're getting 9,697 scores. Moving on to Blender and 3D rendering, the Zenbook Pro Duo 14 OLED here is only slightly slower than the Ryzen 7 5800X desktop version chip, where we don't have any thermal limitations and we can just run it there. We're getting 106.5 in Monster Scene, 61.7 in Junk Shop Scene, and 47.4 in the Classroom Scene. So just still very impressive performance, but obviously we're thermally limited here on this laptop, how far we can push this 14-core CPU. Now, actual real-world applications and some of the benchmarks in those there. We're looking at the Photoshop benchmark over here. The overall score is 780. If you remember the 11900K benchmarks from Cinebench R23, we know that this CPU is much faster than 11900K. But if we look at the 11900K test bench with just iGPU inside the 11900K, but 64 gigabytes of RAM, which is DDR4, much lower RAM, we're getting 1077 score. So basically what you can see in this Photoshop benchmark is that the RAM is the actual bottleneck of this benchmark. The CPU could go much faster, but the RAM capacity gets filled up, and that's why it slowed down the process of this Photoshop application, which is very much what you're going to be seeing in all of those benchmarks, because we're running only 16 gigabyte version model here. In Lightroom Classic, the story is very much the same. 915 points overall, but it's still miles less than the 11900K, that is 1013, and we should be actually beating that. And by the way, 1000 points of this benchmark has been reached with i9 and 9900K with RTX 2080 and 64 gigabytes of RAM. So we're definitely limited by the RAM capacity in here. Moving on to video editing and Premiere Pro, the overall standard score, what we can see, this laptop reach is 422, which is not impressive at all. And yes, we are slightly faster than the Mac Mini M1, but at the same time, we're massively bottlenecked by the GPU and the RAM in this benchmark as well, because Adobe Premiere Pro would love to have much more RAM than this. 16 gigabytes is definitely not enough to run this smoothly. In After Effects, we got the lowest score of any of the PCs I have tested. Bear in mind, this is the first laptop we've actually pushed through the benchmarks, but it is 573. So it's nothing really impressive. It's quite a bit slower than even the 11600K test bench there, but it is because of the RAM and the GPU performance. And when moving on to Resolve, we can see that our standard score is 373, which is very, 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 very low, because Resolve likes to have a very beefy GPU in order to utilize and, work better over here. So we're definitely GPU and RAM bottlenecked here as well. In terms of V-Ray and rendering performance, we got 10,548, which is just a little bit slower than the 5800X. So it's very, very interesting that we're still competing with desktop size CPUs and we're beating them out, which is very, very interesting. And last thing I want to talk about is the battery test. So basically how I ran this test is I was playing a 4K video on YouTube with 50% brightness of both of the screens while running the timer on there as well, as you can see on the B-roll. And that got to 3 hours and 25 minutes and 59 seconds. Bear in mind, the battery option was set to balance mode rather than battery saver mode. So when you're looking at these benchmarks, what is the conclusion here? I think the CPU is very, very capable and very, very powerful, as you can see in some of the CPU only benchmarks. But the 16 gigabytes of DDR5 is a big bottleneck in here, and it could be much faster in these applications when you had more RAM. And then the Xe graphics in there is very good for battery life because it goes under the Intel Evo, that kind of ecosystem, and we don't have a dedicated graphics which will suck much more of the power of this. So it's good to have the longer battery life, but in terms of video editing, it's not that good. It's not enough to have very smooth performance of this, but we know we could do that because we know the CPU is actually capable of doing that. So then when choosing this laptop, which configuration should you go for? Now, first of all, just really look at your workflow and look what you are doing. If you are doing video editing, then you have kind of a separate spec list for this one. If you're doing 2D photo, graphics design, like illustration, something like that, then it's a little bit of a different design and different kind of directions. So first of all, the RAM. Whichever way you're gonna go, I highly recommend you to max out the RAM at 32 gigabytes. I wish there was a 64 gigabyte option as well, but there isn't. So definitely go for 32 gigabytes. Whatever I'm doing on this laptop, I can constantly see like between 70 to 90% use on the laptop. I don't have to do much. Have to have maybe Lightroom, Photoshop open, something like that while browsing the web, something else in the background, and boom, the RAM is absolutely maxed out. So if you're doing any creative professional work, please get the 32 gigabyte version. You're going to thank me later. In fact, Asus, I don't understand why is there even an 8 gigabyte option. Like, you open the kind of thing operating system and you're already 50% used of all of this. I don't know, this shouldn't be an option. 16 gigabytes is like the very minimum. I'd highly recommend you as a creator, if you're getting this for a creative use, get the 32 gigabyte version. Next of all, the graphics, the Xe and Nvidia. Now, if you are a video editor, definitely go for the Nvidia RTX 3050 Ti option. Add that in there because it just has a lot of graphics power to calculate. If you're doing like color grading in Premiere Pro, Davinci Resolve or something like that, you're gonna enjoy the extra GPU power in there, which is gonna be very good. If you are 2D, illustration, Photoshop, photo editor, something like that, then you might actually enjoy just the Xe graphics integrated there because it's well enough for that. Like, I'm doing Photoshop and Lightroom and it works very well here, and I don't really see any like performance difference, or you don't actually need the graphics performance there. So when you don't do video editing, get the Xe graphics. You're going to get longer battery life. It's going to be much better, and it's going to be definitely enough. And with 32 gigabytes of RAM, it's going to run very smoothly, very well. Then the SSD. If you remember from the part 1 video, we can see that there is actually a Gen 4 SSD built in there. And if we look at the benchmarks of that SSD there, then we can see that the read speed is 6.7 gigabytes per second and write speed is about 5 gigabytes per second. So it's very fast and well enough for all of your creative needs. You really don't need anything faster. It's super fast. Now, in theory, you should be able to update that, but there is a little like a caution kind of sticker on the screw. So I'm not sure if this is user kind of serviceable or upgradable, or if you should be upgrading that. But what I would kind of tell you is, if you like a little bit of DIY, you definitely can upgrade that, but you do have to put the windows back on and all that sort of thing. So if you don't mind that, then you can get a very cheap like Gen 4 SSD, like 2 terabyte version, and it's going to be no problem. In fact, I don't know why there isn't a 4 terabyte option, because you can easily get a 4 terabyte Gen 4 SSD. And I don't think this should be limited by any of the other hardware. In theory, you could upgrade it yourself to 4 terabytes, but if you don't prefer to do that, I highly recommend you upgrade your 500 gigabytes to 1 terabyte version. Just if you're doing any work on the go, you're gonna be thankful to have a little bit more of breathing space and capacity on the internal SSD to store some of the projects, files, something like that, so you don't have to carry any dongles or external SSDs with you. And then the CPU option. Should you upgrade the CPU or downgrade the CPU? If you do have a little bit more complex workflow and you like to have multitasking, a lot of things open at the same time, then the i7 is the best bang for buck kind of option in the middle ground. The i9 isn't going to be much better for you, and it's a small chassis. It's going to be much more thermally limited, and you're not going to see that much performance difference in the i9 12900H. Although at the same time, if you really need the 3D rendering, modeling and kind of performance, then the i9 is a better option there with a little bit of faster clock speeds. But I still think you're going to be better off with the i7 12700H. In fact, I do think there's a reason why Asus sent this i7 12700H for a review rather than the i9 model or the i5 model. If you have any parts of the laptop that you want me to cover in the long-term review or the user experience, then let me know in the comment section below. Hopefully this video helped you to choose the Asus Zenbook Pro 14 Duo OLED. And if you are interested in picking this up, I'm going to leave the affiliate links in the description below, which means that I will get a small commission with no extra cost to you. It just helps the channel. And yeah, thanks for doing that. And that's it. Likes and subs, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.